Hello, and thank you for joining me for my presentation, Take That, Tipper Gore, Alanis Morissette, Suburban Youth, and the Politics of Consumer-Friendliness. Of course, a square inch sticker didn't stop Alanis from selling 13 million records. Take that, Tipper Gore, writes Flavor Wire's Jillian Mapes. The 1995 commercial success of Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill amid the nascent parental advisory labels shows that U.S. girls listened and were allowed to listen to Jagged, which addressed taboo topics like assault, mental illness, and anorexia. Jagged articulated a politicized girlhood narrative through a medium that reached and empowered a wide population of U.S. girls thanks to Morissette's consumer-friendly sound and image. Yet, Jagged's commercial appeal was used to undermine its impact, as critics set Morissette at odds with Riot Grrrl's legacy of overtly political musical narratives of girlhood. In this presentation, I argue that Morissette's commercial appeal did not negate her music's political saliency, but rather functioned as a political tool that allowed Jagged to circumvent 1990s suburban censorship and present girls with feminist practices in which they could viably participate. In the 1990s, parents were tasked with new imperatives and provided with new tools for intervention in youth media consumption. During this time, the commercial music industry also confronted pressures to accommodate parents' concerns about keeping children safe from explicit content in music. In 1985, the Parents Music Resource Center, or the PMRC, co-founded by Mary Elizabeth Tipper Gore, proposed the idea of the Parental Advisory Label, or the PAL, to the Recording Industry Association of America, beginning a decade-long debate on objectionable lyrics in popular music. Within months of the 1985 hearings, the RIAA adopted the Parental Advisory Label. In the early 1990s, the confluence of PMRC's disbandment and the swift rise of rap and hip-hop shifted the outrage and activism around obscene content in popular music away from rock musicians, heavy metal bands, and singer-songwriters to Black male rappers. The momentum of the PMRC waned just in time for Tipper Gore to leave the organization after becoming second lady in 1993, after which the group quietly disbanded. The end of the PMRC's activism effectively ended the conversation on objectionable lyrics in rock music specifically, yet general anxieties about youth exposure to mature content via popular music persisted. As gangster rap entered the mainstream in the early 1990s, this genre became the newest target of parent scrutiny. In 1994, the Music Lyrics and Commerce Senate hearings revitalized conversations around objectionable lyrics in popular music. This time, however, the discussion was focused squarely on gangster rap and misogynist lyrics. These 1994 hearings resulted in a change to the PAL, yet the most significant results of the 1994 hearings was the shift in focus regarding the perceived profile of objectionable popular music. The 1994 testimonies before U.S. Congress set the tone for turn-of-millennium discussions on objectionable lyric content in popular music, one that shifted attention away from genres addressed by the PMRC and specifically toward Black men working in rap and hip-hop. A profile bias applied with little regard to artists' actual lyric content. This shift of attention towards Black men meant that white women, especially in mainstream popular music, could more easily sing about what would otherwise be considered objectionable content and even earn a PAL without attracting parents' disapproval. Despite proposals in the legislative sphere, no restrictions were ultimately placed on who could purchase albums affixed with a PAL. Parental advisory labels did not prohibit a child's purchase of these albums, but CDs were nevertheless packaged and sold with parents in mind, as record labels understood that parents were facing revitalized pressure to monitor their children's listening habits. As 1990s parents in U.S. suburbia monitored their children's music consumption, they relied heavily on the outward-facing aspects of music products. These aspects included the parental advisory label, the race, gender, and age of the artist, cover art, songs heard on the radio, and artist interviews in magazines and on television. In order for girls to have contact with a CD or artist beyond the radio, it needed to pass the mom test. Mothers, specifically, served as the cultural gatekeepers of the home and were involved in deciding which cultural products were allowed into the house and specifically their daughters' bedrooms. Much of media consumption takes place in the home, specifically in the bedroom for girls. In 1976, Angela McRobbie and Jenny Garber introduced their concept of bedroom culture, which proposes that girls experiment with cultural products, including music, as part of constructing a safe, private space in which they may act freely. In academic writing on girls' interactions with cultural products, the theory of bedroom culture often romanticizes the girls' bedroom as a site of wholly autonomous and isolated cultural engagement. However, as gender studies scholar Mary Celeste Kearney notes in her 2007 critique of McRobbie and Garber, such characterizations of girls' bedrooms as fully autonomous spaces, quote, do not mention how parents' control of domestic spaces normalizes their uninvited entry into and supervision of their daughters' bedrooms, end quote. Kearney's theorization of the girls' bedroom as a space wherein girls establish identity through engagement with cultural products in the context of uncertain privacy acknowledges the economic and cultural imperatives for turn-of-millennium suburban parents to intervene in their daughters' purchase of and engagement with entertainment media. One way by which parents could monitor their daughters' bedrooms was by regulating the music that girls could use to soundtrack their space. Commercial women singer-songwriters benefited from commercially friendly images and reputations that deflected the critical eye of parents on the lookout for obscene music. Suburban life prioritized control and safety, and this demographic of consumers was approaching the majority mark among the US population. Suburban parents faced pressure to monitor their children's media intake, and the tools by which they could do so were increasing in number, accessibility, and application. Thus, analysis of these singer-songwriters' commercial appeal is key to understanding the socio-political significance of these artists and the depth of their impact, as these qualities helped artists circumvent suburban censorship and anxieties in order to bring a politicized discourse on girlhood into the zeitgeist of suburban middle-class girls at the turn of the millennium. Through their album cover art, women singer-songwriters at the turn of the millennium projected a commercial-friendly image that emphasized emotional exploration while de-emphasizing aggression and sexuality. This particular representation of women's voices might seem counter to the militancy of previous musical iterations of third-wave feminism by Riot Grrrl. However, by emphasizing commercial appeal, both in persona and music, singer-songwriters at the turn of the millennium could get this music into suburban girls' hands. In so doing, these artists could then engage with suburban US girl listeners on topics relevant to feminist activism at the turn of the millennium. Album covers depicted women singer-songwriters at the turn of the millennium as unthreatening yet emotionally deep, which appealed to girl listeners and their parents respectively. Vulnerable and desexualized poses, diverted eye contact, and ethereal photo editing made the artist seem unthreatening and tranquil, but also otherworldly, wise, and meditative. This simultaneously commercially friendly yet emotionally complex image made this music an accessible and attractive tool for girls' own emotional and social exploration. The visual presentation of these CDs augmented girl listeners' experience of the music and met parental approval at the numerous junctures at which parents could intervene in their daughters' access to these artists and their lyrical content based on the album's outward appearance. Girls engaged with this album art at each stage of the purchasing and listening process, seeing the album advertised on TV or in magazines, finding it in store or on a mail order form, showing it to their parents when they got home from the mall or received the album in the mail, and holding the CD case while they listened to the music, looking at images of the singer and reading along with the lyrics. Album art for CDs by women singer-songwriters in the 90s and 2000s depicted these artists as unthreatening through body language, eye contact, and photo editing. The cover for Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill includes two images of Morissette's face, layered on top of each other to achieve a watercolor effect, combining warm and cool color tints with high contrast and brightness. Both copies of Morissette's face are slightly transparent, and the singer-songwriter looks off into the distance with a smile that carries the enigmatic qualities of the Mona Lisa. Morissette is posed in such a way that indicates vulnerability and softness, and edited with effects that underplay her belonging to present-day reality. This is one instance of several where effects applied to photos used as album art for women singer-songwriters in the 90s and 2000s helped depict these artists as soft, out of time, otherworldly, and ethereal, or at the very least, distant from the present and accordingly current events. Cover art that depicts the artist with closed, covered, or diverted eyes is also common among these albums. The lack of or obscured eye contact on these albums covers thwarts assumptions about aggression or anger that suburban parents may have associated with potentially emotionally and politically charged music for teens at the turn of the millennium. These album covers also feature photos of the artists that direct the viewer's attention to the singer's face, deliberately dodging the sexualization of these artists' bodies by the male gaze. The diverted eye contact, vintage and ethereal imagery, and evaded sexualization that signaled women singer-songwriters as safe to suburban parents were the very qualities that also signified these artists' intimacy and emotional depth to girl listeners. Popular women singer-songwriters at the turn of the millennium who wrote emotionally and politically informed music to which teen girls listened were also overwhelmingly white and feminine presenting. These artists' bodies and their presentation worked to their advantage in the same ways as the poses used in their photo shoots and the editing applied to these images. The feminine white body stood in stark contrast to the artists at the center of the contemporary debates on obscene lyrics in popular music that targeted Black male artists, and these singer-songwriters benefited from this distance. While several of these albums were labeled with a PAL, the images of the artists on these CDs' front covers provided parents with the information that they needed to dismiss Tipper Gore's urgings. Despite these commercial women singer-songwriters' overt swearing and references to sex and violence, girl listeners could access this music, as parents readily overrode the PAL based on the familiar, safely presented bodies they saw on these artists' CD cases. In 2015, when Jagged Little Pill celebrated its 20th anniversary, the willingness of parents, specifically mothers, to ignore the PAL in the case of such artists as Alanis Morissette was remembered as key to girls' first interactions with the very content that merited Jagged's PAL. As Mallory Karev Bussell remembers, "My very first CD was Alanis Morissette because I didn't think Z100 played You Oughta Know enough, and I thought the song was so edgy. I begged my mom to buy the album for me and she did, even though she noticed the parental advisory suggested symbol on the cover. Luckily, she never listened to it with me because Jagged Little Pill had lyrics I did not understand as a kid, but surely were recognizably inappropriate to an adult's ear." As Kara's anecdote shows, parents readily overlooked the PAL sticker based on the information they could glean from looking at the album's packaging. This is one example of a greater pattern where these women's bodies and the representation thereof in the album art for their CDs remove them from the revitalized discourse on objectionable content in popular music, which allowed them to connect directly with listeners, often introducing themes and rhetoric much more edgy than their album art let on. The very aspects of Morissette's music that facilitated its contact with a suburban girl audience were the same reasons this music was publicly dismissed by critics as vapid, apolitical, and annoying. Critics interpreted Morissette's commercial success as mutually exclusive to political activism, so Morissette's focus on intensely personal narratives was consistently written off as little more than another commercial tactic. Of Jagged, Lucy O'Brien of Vox wrote, "She only has to iron out the sometimes shrill, mannered aspects of her delivery. No one loves a whiner, and she'll be cool." Critics undermined Morissette's sincerity, the seriousness of her song's topics, and the potential impact of Morissette's music on listening audiences by painting her attention to trauma as little more than a marketing ploy. Discounting the seriousness of Morissette's music in turn discounted the seriousness of the issues that teen girls in the US were confronting at the turn of the millennium. The commercial success of albums such as Jagged were evidence that these girl listeners were struggling to find a place in popular discourse to address these topics, and that this music presented a forum by which girls could do exactly this. In contrast to critiques published in publications with adult readership, mass print media for teen girl audiences emphasized Jagged's social impact. In such magazines as 17 and Glamour, Morissette's musical catalog is depicted as a didactic resource, an intermediary that brought girls' concerns about taboo topics into the mainstream. In 1999, Glamour magazine claimed, quote, "Morissette's theme is self-discovery," and in the magazine's December 2002 Women of the Year feature, Morissette is listed among other, quote, "heroes and idols." This segment on Morissette highlights how her music amplified the concerns of US girls. Oliver Jones writes, quote, "She's the voice of her generation, broadcasting feelings most of us wouldn't dare scrawl in our diaries." Yet, Jones concedes that, quote, "Morissette's music remains more personal than political." However, what Jones overlooks here is that for Morissette and her listeners, the expression of personal experience is the very thing that made her music political. By listening to Jagged, girls received affirmation and advice and found a safe space in this music, whether it was in the comfort of their own rooms or at one of Morissette's concerts, to explore the parts of their lived experiences that were not adequately addressed by mainstream feminism and that fell outside the scope of acceptable US suburban discussion. As the authorial and sonic voice that sparked her audience's challenge of authority and perfectionism, Morissette's evaluation of these listeners' reactions to her music evidences that girls not only engaged in self-narrative practices by way of this music, but also, when ready, brought these practices into the public sphere. As a commercial success, Morissette's personal story was made public and modeled for her fans an artistically and emotionally complex way of discussing girlhood. This became a motivating factor not only in Morissette's career, but also in the consumption and engagement patterns of her fan base. Moments when fans would, quote, come up to her at shows or write her notes about how any given song had supported them in some shape or form, end quote, is what Morissette's credits with her continuing to make music after Jagged Little Pill. Thank you.